Giuliano's body was brought before Lorenzo. After taking a moment to compose himself, still bleeding from his neck, he began to write a letter to the Sforza of Milan, with whom they were allies, requesting aid. Given the turmoil that followed Galeazzo's assassination, however, the amount of aid they could lend was understandably not that substantial. There was a good chance that the Pope had more planned, and they definitely needed more men to help fortify the Republic of Florence as a whole. The population, however, was still rallied completely behind Lorenzo. The streets echoed with the cries of Paie, Paie, which was a cheer for the Medici coat of arms. In fact, the Pazzi never really had a chance of winning over the people. Florence, for all intents and purposes, was Lorenzo's. Though the conspiracy was put on the kibosh, there were a lot of things to tend to. Firstly, of course, retribution. A judiciary body known as the Council of Eight, which was formed for internal security issues and treasonous accusations, prepared to mete out justice, or what it referred to as justice, toward the Pazzi and their cohorts. Of course, as you can imagine, Lorenzo's hand was undoubtedly guiding the whole process. If something glazed over or he failed to address something for some reason, though, the other officials were very quick to bring it to his attention. You see, it's one thing to be a brutal tyrant with just a few henchmen. It's quite another to be the central pillar that all of the politicians, judges, officials, everybody relied on. Lorenzo wanted revenge, but these people also sought a strike against themselves. For example, Cesare Petrucci, the gonfaloniere who seized Salviati, he would have definitely been removed from office and outright killed. These men recognized that, and it led to some rather gruesome justice. Firstly, the Council of Eight met on that very same day in the afternoon. Archbishop Salviati and Jacopo Bracciolini were questioned pretty thoroughly, while Francesco de Pazzi was detained, still bleeding from his self-inflicted leg wound. The mercenaries that Salviati brought with him were all still in the waiting room within the Signoria. They'd been there the whole day, and being mercenaries of all things, they weren't given kind treatment. The doors were opened, and in poured a mass of fresh city guards, and well, you've been sitting in a waiting room all day and suddenly you were attacked out of nowhere. Well, I don't think I need to tell you how it turned out exactly. Suffice to say, the wounded survivors were thrown from windows and the top of the Signoria. Citizens who saw this ran over to strip and desecrate their corpses. And by desecrate, I am including dismemberment. You see, the Renaissance, in most minds, brings forth some sort of sophisticated, very peaceable sort of mindset, but this wasn't a sophisticated matter of handling of affairs, folks. I mean, this was grisly. This was hideous. People ran around town with various limbs, body parts, and organs, and they were laughing. They were having a field day with this whole damn thing. After all, good old Lorenzo was alive, and his foes were dead or captured. The city officials didn't mind, of course, because this was sending a message. The populace was on their side. If they happened to miss anybody who was involved in this, they would have been scared out of their minds for fear of being lynched. The remaining captives, however, were dealt with very swiftly. Bracciolini and Salviati were noosed, and they were kicked off from the bell tower that housed the Vacca. Their corpses were left there. By the end of the first day, nearly 50 corpses were hanging from the Signoria. Leonardo da Vinci was an actual witness to this whole thing, and he made a drawing of Bernardo Beroncelli's remains. Montesecco made good legwork, but he was caught about a week later. When he was brought before the tribunal, he made a complete confession, which ultimately is one of the major sources of information behind this conspiracy's development and plotting. He was beheaded shortly thereafter, which was honestly about as honorable of a death as an accomplice in this could have asked for. The priests who attacked Lorenzo, Antonio Maffei and Stefano de Bagnone, on the other hand, they made their getaway and sought refuge within a Benedictine monastery, the Badia Fiorentina, which can be found near the Palazzo de' Pazzi, where Francesco fled to. They bunkered down and were protected by the monks within, but by May 3rd, they were finally handed over to the city guards. When they were led through the square outside the Signoria, the two were jumped by the crowd and beaten nearly to death. Once they were pulled away, barely alive, they faced their true punishment. Their noses and ears were lopped off, and then they were hung from the Signoria with the other guilty men. Jacopo de Pazzi made it a few days' walk from town before he was caught in the mountains by some rather rowdy locals. Jacopo was beaten within an inch of his life, possibly to the point where he was quite literally paralyzed, before being thrown and hung from the Signoria. Thanks to his title as a noble, however, Messer Jacopo de Pazzi wasn't cut down for the mob to desecrate. He was buried later on the same day, but the populace, well, as you can imagine, they were a crazy and superstitious lot back then. The very night that Jacopo was executed, a pretty ugly storm blew through the land. It drowned crops and caused some pretty significant flood damage. This wasn't a coincidence in their minds. It was pretty clearly a sign from God, because Jacopo wasn't properly punished. With that thought process in mind, a small group of people actually dug up his corpse, tied a rope around his ankles, and rode around town for hours, dragging his body behind them. Wherever they went, they shouted, blew horns, and announced his arrival as if he was royalty or a high-end noble. When they grew bored of this, they decided to go about getting rid of the body. But there was a pit stop. They headed to Jacopo's home, where his servants were evidently still residing. They carried his body to the front door, and they knocked on the door with his head, or possibly used it outright as a ramming mechanism, while shouting to the servants inside that their master had returned. After this, they decided just to dump his body in the nearby Arno River. Following this, a whiteout of everything Pazzi related took place. Living or dead, Pazzi family members lost all of their possessions to the city of Florence. Anyone with the last name of Pazzi had to change it immediately, or, well, very bad things would happen. The coat of arms was destroyed nearly everywhere it existed, and if a relative of a family had married anyone who was a Pazzi, the whole family immediately lost their right to ever hold office. Also, there was an annual event preceding Easter which was banned from being practiced because it was started by the Pazzi. The Pazzi and most of the conspirators were now dealt with. The final troublemaker was the biggest of all, Pope Sixtus IV. Thing is, he was directly tied into this not only through Salviati's involvement, but also through Montesecco's confession. Additionally, among the men executed were people from surrounding territories. When the Sforza of Milan were asked for aid, that also set off red flags in the surrounding area. This looked like Lorenzo versus some dudes, but there was a lot of spill down from this. This was very serious. The Pope immediately went about arresting and seizing the property of any Florentines within Rome. Though he released them shortly thereafterward, he kept their money and property. He also excommunicated Lorenzo and ordered him to march to Rome along with everybody else involved in these executions, which was a lot of folks, so that they could be incarcerated. Their belongings and wealth would be stripped as well, all of which would be claimed by the church, of course. He declared war on Florence, and if he refused to comply within 2 months, he'd basically tag team with King Ferrante of Naples, and, well, he'd obliterate everyone within Florence. In the face of further harassment, Florence was, for the most part, defiant. They stood their ground, causing Sixtus to become even angrier. He rallied folks from Lucca, Siena, and had two armies ready to strike. The first was led by King Ferrante of Naples' son, Alfonso. The second was led by Federico de Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino. The Florentines responded to this pressure by stating that they actually declared Sixtus, the Pope, to be excommunicated. The printing press was brand spanking new technology by this point, barely a year old, and it saw a pretty heavy debut as letters of excommunication against Sixtus were printed and distributed en masse throughout Europe. As you can imagine, this made him look pretty damn silly. In spite of this rather brave response to an overwhelming opponent, Lorenzo was a realist. He knew that this was due to him in the end. He spoke in front of the Piazza della Signoria, saying he was going to turn himself in so that this would end. Well, whether it was calculated or not, we don't know, but the crowd refused to allow him to do this. His fellow Florentines had his back, and, in addition to giving him a rather impressive entourage of 12 bodyguards at all times, he was elected to the Council of 10, which planned and coordinated war efforts. In 1479, things grew rather dire. The bubonic plague was making another brief visit, and disease in general was becoming an issue. Lorenzo, in fact, was nearly bedridden for most of the summer due to being ill. Still, Florence held out against the Pope's offensives. Though Florence wasn't receiving direct support from Milan or Venice, Montefeltro had to be careful with his offensives. If something went wrong, he could set off a domino effect that'd spring them into action. Milan said, finally, that they'd be willing to formally assist Florence, but only if they broke off their alliance with Venice. This was pretty undesirable due to trade and long-term affairs. However, Venice at the moment was wrapped up in the tail end of a largely marine-based conflict with some invading Turks, so their aid was pretty half-hearted. The full backing of Milan would be nice. However, Lorenzo was told that if he broke this off and left Venice to be blindsided by these turn of events, King Ferrante would gladly switch sides. King Ferrante, who I described in the first segment as a pretty thorough politician, he was willing to change sides and support Lorenzo if Lorenzo allowed him to make a land grab toward Venice. Of course, Lorenzo knew that Ferrante would use this as an excuse to grab up some of Tuscany as well as the Venetian territories. Still, it was better than being completely crushed by Sixtus. This is where Lorenzo put everything on the table. He personally set out sailing from Pisa to Naples. He arrived loaded with all sorts of money around Christmas at this point. He then went around spending the money like crazy with all these sorts of ridiculous displays of goodwill. He knew many people within Naples. Adding to that, he was childhood friends with one of Ferrante's sons. Still, this guy was a snake in the grass. In spite of the glitz, glamour, and charm, this guy would skin him without hesitation. He was a fan of the path of least resistance and most profit, though. This conflict between Florence and Sixtus was taking way longer than Ferrante was hoping, and this was an easy out with some potentially easy cash and territory being left on the table for him. Why the act on Lorenzo's part? Well, Lorenzo was on the verge of being destroyed by Sixtus at this point. If he came to Ferrante for his help, groveling on his hands and knees, Ferrante would have taken him behind the woodshed. This was a poker face and an incredibly risky maneuver. Given that Lorenzo had planned this for nearly a year, this was most likely his Hail Mary attempt. Ferrante, however, was notorious for his ability to obscure his motives. People of the era who haggled with him found that he was damn near impossible to read. This was how he developed a knack for backstabbing people so often. He was cold-blooded and unpredictable. However, Lorenzo managed to actually win him over. After 10 weeks of parties, social gatherings, and closed-door meetings, they cemented an alliance. As a result, Ferrante switched sides away from Sixtus. The importance of this? Sixtus lost almost all of his muscle. Montefeltro wouldn't dare try anything against Naples as a whole. Plus, Ferrante's son, Alfonso, was very, very nearby with a very large force of men. If he made any sort of act of aggression against Lorenzo, Alfonso would turn right around and curb stomp him, basically. Ferrante, however, as you can imagine, he still made out like a thief. I mean, he made out with lots and lots of profit as a result of this, but it wasn't exactly a bad loss for Florence, because at that point, they were fighting a losing battle. Sixtus said that Lorenzo would remain excommunicated from the church until he presented himself in Rome with an apology. However, Sixtus was left with no major power to back it up beyond, hey, you're excommunicated. He couldn't do anything on the brute force front now that Naples was allied with him. He continued to demand Lorenzo's apology in order to save face, but Lorenzo didn't even want to be in the same city as that asshole. The tables soon turned for the Pope, however. In the 1480s, the Turks invaded Italy in force, overshadowing what Lorenzo had taken part in. Finding himself suddenly short on allies, he accepted Lorenzo's apology, which was offered to him in Rome through a dozen Florentine representatives. Lorenzo still didn't want to be anywhere near him. Fuck it. Good enough. However, Lorenzo didn't live happily in the end. Details are kind of thin, but for the remainder of his life following the conspiracy, he became far more unforgiving toward even the slightest bit of opposition. By the time he died, in fact, he wasn't terribly popular. The banking family business was in a nosedive due to poor decisions on his part, and his oldest son, who is known by the appropriate moniker of Piero the Unfortunate, took over the family business. The nickname fits quite perfectly because he just spent the bank's money like crazy and partied all the time. And this caused the Medici Bank to train wreck as a whole, ruining the entire family's reputation in the eyes of Florence. Two of his other children, though, would go on to lead much better lives. His second son, Giovanni, would later become the Pope under the name of Pope Leo X. He also adopted his brother's illegitimate child, Giulio, who also went on to become the Pope that would replace his brother, this one being named Pope Clement VIII. Bear in mind that by the time they ascended to the papacy, corruption had been tapered down considerably. In the end, the death of Lorenzo's brother, the attempt on his life, and the conflict with the Pope had left scars that ran deep and seemed to change him considerably. Though this affected his twilight years of his life, he would still be known in death as Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was seen as one of the pillars of the early Italian Renaissance. And, with his death, the focus of the world moved back to Rome.